Okay, welcome back to another episode of FSUFO, also known as Forbidden Science. This is the show, the podcast, I should say, to bring me up to our present century, which to my mind makes us look up, makes us look within at witnesses and people who research and have touched the phenomena. And sometimes we even peek under the edge of the tinfoil hat to look at all points of view and all kinds of involvement here. Mr. Music. I love that. It puts me right in the mood here. Today we have a very special guest. And first of all, let me point out that the show might look a little different to our regulars because we don't have Michael with us today. Co-hosting duties today are fallen to Justin Brown, a good longtime friend of mine and an avid UFO guy who has done many things. I like to think of him as a film thingy guy who has done a little award-winning doc, and I know is going to produce more. And I often think of him as lightning in a bottle. And you're here today. Michael's missing in action. I refrain from speculating about his whereabouts because I'm never right about that. But what I am sure of is he will surface again as he always does. Um,
Yeah,
so
it's great to be here, Chris. Thanks for having me. And like I said to Michael before and you, I'm always willing to help out wherever and whenever I can.
Well, we're going to test that theory, I'm sure, as time goes on, possibly on weekends. I don't know. Michael has his things to do, and so do we. And today we have a very special guest, and he's connected to us through the ether from St. John's, Newfoundland, which is his home. And our guest today is Noah Morritt. And he's not your typical UFO guy. In fact, he might not even be a UFO guy. We'll get him to define that a little better. Noah says that he is a folklorist, and I know that's true, and a cultural historian, and I'm going to get him to expand on that. But first of all, Noah, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, you and I have
Welcome.
met before and know each other from the Shag Harbour area. But our meetings and our knowing of each other has come about as you've been so kind in the past to come in and do duties there as a master of ceremonies at some of their uh, annual little festivals and actual symposiums, etc., sort of thing in the past. And man, you sparkle in that role, sort of thing. And I've said, why is he here? And the locals have told me, most notably Lori Wickens, that you were here doing the work you're doing. And perhaps you could start by explaining to our listeners today why you were in Shag Harbour and why you were in for an extended period, when that was, what the goal is, and what you do.
Sure, Chris, and thank you again for having me on the show. As they mentioned, my name is Noah Morritt, and I'm a cultural historian and a folklorist. And I traveled to Shag Harbour in 2016 to conduct fieldwork for my doctoral dissertation out of the folklore department at Memorial University. And as Chris mentioned too, I didn't come at this as a UFO researcher. I more or less came at this as someone who specializes in oral tradition, particularly local legends. And my interest in the Shag Harbour story was I wanted to understand what it meant to live in a community where this kind of story had been attached to so firmly to your sense of local identity. And it was I spent 2 summers in Shag Harbour in 2016 and 2017. And during that time, I spoke with local residents. I conducted some interviews with UFO witnesses, as well as prominent members of the community who had a really good sense, of local society, local culture, local history. And I also spent a lot of my time at the Shag Harbour UFO Interpretive Center, which is the community museum that the Shag Harbour Incident Society established and continues to run. Which, its mission really is to preserve memory of what happened in Shag Harbour and to tell that story. And so I was really interested in, how the society did that work through its museum. Museums and archives, really, heritage is my background.
Mm.
And I was really interested in the ways that, museums, one, exhibit the UFO phenomena, two, interpret the UFO phenomena, and then three, how they become sites for public discussion and debate of the phenomena. Right. And, one of the things that, I've come to understand through my research, and even as I was planning before I went out, is that, there aren't a lot of spaces where people can come together to talk about UFOs, to discuss their experiences with others who share, who have shared that, right, who have seen these things themselves, possibly are experiencers, right, who've experienced alien abduction or encounters with extraterrestrial beings. And these kinds of spaces are pretty rare. The Shag Harbour uh, Interpretive Center, as far as I know, it's one of what, maybe two or three sites in Canada where, a museum actually interprets UFO experiences. Of course, there's the UFO museum in Roswell, New Mexico, but what's in Shag Harbor is very different from the kind of well marketed kind of the UFO kish that becomes associated, right, with sites where UFOs have happened, and communities want to be able to make some money off of there's tourist potential, but Shag Harbor was a very different situation. And I really enjoyed the time I spent at that museum because I really got to understand, how a museum could become a space where people came together to talk about this and to collectively interpret their experiences. And so that was the work that I did when I was
Mm.
in the community. And there was a lot of historical research that was done too, outside of the community. I don't know how many archives I went to try and find material, which is not as as you well know, is not an easy thing to do.
No,
Um,
no.
so, I spent quite a lot of time, going through historical records, going through materials that had been collected by other folklorists in the field, by anthropologists, just to get a sense of, what had been collected, how had it been interpreted, and, how could we collectively use these materials as a basis to try to understand what was going on in Shag Harbor, and, where Shag Harbor can be situated within the larger history of
Mm.
UFOs in the Atlantic provinces, in Canada during the 1960s, 1970s.
Wow, you've answered that question, and to be honest, Noah, I've never considered before its mission as such beyond being a museum, beyond something that's going to ring out the odd tourist dollar. But you're right; it does serve that function well as a meeting place and hub. And if you'd asked me, does it do that? I would have said yes. But no, you've just pointed out like seeing their mission, their function through the eyes of a folklorist, of a cultural historian, of somebody concerned with heritage, as opposed to just somebody giving a quick answer. One thing popped in my head while you're talking too. It's one thing to say, "Well, I'm at Memorial, and I stayed in there. It was great. It was insightful. It was part of." But the first question popped in my mind when I was listening to your voice: was it difficult with your profs, with your professors, to allow you to choose that as a subject of dissertation?
The short answer to that is no. And that might surprise
Mm.
you and some of your listeners, but the reason for that is that folklorists, traditionally have been very open to research involving the supernatural and the paranormal. In fact, folklorists from the very beginning of our discipline, we have studied the supernatural. Supernatural legends are an important part of oral tradition in virtually every culture.
Hmm.
And as folklorists, and this may also be surprising too to some of your listeners too, given that there's a long tradition of academics basically working as skeptics for the most part and dismissing the experiences of witnesses and experiencers, but that's never been the case in folklore studies.
Hmm.
We're not interested in whether or not the phenomena exists. The fact that someone claims to have had an experience alone is significant enough to us to warrant study. And I like my rest of my colleagues, approach this really from a position of ontological neutrality, and that's a fancy way of basically saying that I neither believe nor disbelieve that folks have had these encounters. The fact is, something has happened, and as folklorists, generally we accept that some kind of a phenomena has presented itself before someone's senses, and that this has stuck in their mind as something that was significant that they are unable to explain. And they have done their best to draw on the interpretive resources that are provided by their culture through oral tradition, through things like legends and mythology. And sometimes people come up short, right? There
Hmm.
are no available interpretations for what they
No,
have
no,
seen,
no.
right?
I'm
And
gonna I'm gonna tell you, a lot of ufologists could learn an important lesson then from folklore. I can tell you, um, too often people that are closer to my genre, and I guess I'm a ufologist. They walk in, and often they have a briefcase, and often there's forms in it. You know, and forms. When you start looking at what angle was it at against the horizon, what color can you pick it from this chart, this kind of thing, you know, it becomes limiting because, as I've said before, yes, there are essential elements as a UFO researcher you must do. But there are times and there are cases when you have to go beyond that or step outside of that, you know. And I just think it's so refreshing, to hear that, because to me it was, it would be like there was a time I was a member of MUFON, and MUFON is a great group, and they've been a great help to me and their membership. Many of their experts and listed people have been of such assistance to me over the years. But I'd have trouble if I had gone through their program and been a researcher there, a field investigator by their standards, because there's times in cases I know I've walked into where you just have to set those forms aside. Because, as I've said, the universe is made of stories, not merely atoms and molecules. And this is what people relate to. And this is, where, look, you need two things for a UFO experience, be it a sighting, encounter, abduction, whatever. You need a UFO and you need a witness, and both are crucial elements, right? I don't know. It just seems sometimes like, eh, I can't get that across enough. And you're right, something has happened here. And if it isn't nuts and bolts, and if you can never determine it, it's still a value. It's a value psychologically, and probably more importantly, it could be culturally significant, right? And you know what? Justin Brown's been quiet for too long. What do you think about what he said? I can't believe you sat there. You're going to have Moss on your north side, so you must have a question by now. I
I
can't
do,
believe
yeah.
I've got to poke you to do this. Huh? That's not you.
Well, I'm just trying to take it all in, but you stole the words right from my mouth. I think the field does need more people like ontological neutralists, like our guest Noah. And that being said, let's get to the brass tacks here. What is your cultural interpretation? I know that you're saying it doesn't matter to you whether the phenomenon is real or not, coming from your profession as a master's graduate and now going for your doctorate. Do you have a personal viewpoint on the phenomenon itself outside of
I
your professional
Yeah,
opinion? Are you
no,
ready to
that
put yourself
like
on the
that's
chopping block there?
that's a good question, and I can honestly say that a lot of my colleagues get very uncomfortable when they're asked this question, right? You're right. It's very easy for us to say that, we're not interested in the phenomena itself and whether or not it does or does not exist, and rather we're interested in understanding its social and cultural, value and significance. But when it comes down to it, something has been seen, experienced by someone, and the question is, it's there. What was it? Um, you know, I would say that, onto for me, my neutrality of belief, like, goes further than just being a methodological point of view and perspective. That, I honestly don't have an explanation for what happened in Shag Harbour. And after having spent, I've been doing research. I started my field research in 2016, but my work on this project goes back right to 2014. And after having interviewed witnesses, after having spent time in the community, after having spent 2 summers working at the Interpretive Center, working with visitors, listening to their stories and experiences, and after having looked through the historical record and everything that we know about this, I don't know what it was. I can't draw a conclusion, and I think that alone is significant. The fact of the matter is, and when people ask me, like, and when I started the project, there were sort of, those kind of, ridiculing comments. Well, it was probably just a satellite, or it was probably a meteorite or something like that, right? Um, there's no evidence that it was either of those things, really. And even after all of this work, I don't have an answer for what happened. What I can say with certainty, however, is that folks in Shag Harbour saw something enter to the water. It floated on the surface of the water for approximately half an hour, and it disappeared beneath the surface. Those are the facts of this case. And Chris is well aware of those facts and has done an extraordinary job documenting them, and they stand up. Chris did his work. Don Ledger did his work. Graham Sims has done his work, and I went through it. I read their materials. I did a really a complete reevaluation of the evidence and material that was available, and it happened, right? And
Yeah,
that's that's what I and what else is there to say, really? That it happened. Now, what it was, I can't say. I don't have the expertise to be able to really evaluate the actual details of the sighting reports, but at least from the facts as they are presented, something happened in Shag Harbour. A phenomena occurred. People saw it, and there was an investigation, right? There were reports, there were newspaper articles, there were editorials. There was controversy generated by what happened. So, something happened. It was socially and culturally significant. I would even go as far to say it was politically significant too. And the facts speak for themselves, and how we choose to interpret it, each of us, is based on a number of, it's based on our previous experience. It's based on our own, systems of belief. It's based on, our own cultural and social backgrounds. And, what I can say for myself personally is it reinforces
Well, I'll jump
say.
in. Oh, there he's
just
back.
let me add one thing there. Chris talked about the precursor of getting into this type of research
Mhm.
with your professors, but what's been the aftermath of having put together a paper like this, not only with professors but your peers? What's been the fallout? And I say fallout on purpose.
Yeah, I would say there is no fallout, and that's because that's discipline specific, right? That is because my as folklorists, we have been studying the supernatural for a very long time, and there's a pre-existing tradition of this kind of research long before I got involved with what I was doing. And those trailblazers, folks like Eddie Bullard, for example, his
Yes.
extraordinary work on folklore and UFOs, they set a foundation for this kind of work. And I am a direct beneficiary of that work, in that they created that intellectual space where I'm able to explore these kinds of questions, without outright hostility from my supervisors and my colleagues.
Well, Noah, I've got a question though. Like, since your field allows you within it and others to be so open, you mentioned that they were very uncomfortable at first with your choice. Why would they be uncomfortable in a field that's so open?
Well, I would say not uncomfortable from the perspective of the phenomena itself, right? A UFO crash being the subject of study, but rather, what would be the conclusion? Like, what would be the reason for doing that research, right? What would be its objectives, right? And to do the research simply for the point of answering the question of whether or not UFOs do or do not exist, it would be regarded by my colleagues and supervisors as an inappropriate question to ask. And, the question is naturally raised by the topic itself, but it is, and I would say it's beyond the disciplinary purview of what we do, right? And
Okay.
I do my very best not to speak outside of my area of expertise, right? I'm not a physicist, right? I don't know much about aerospace technology, and so I can't draw conclusions about what something was or was not based on what a witness has reported,
Hmm.
and I wouldn't pretend to be able to do so. What I'm able to do, however, is that the narrative of the experience, as it's created and presented as a form of oral tradition, I can examine that using the tools of my discipline. I'm able to understand the social and cultural impacts of what has happened, and I'm able to place it in its historical context. Those are the tools that are available to me, and those are the tools that I brought with me to Shag Harbour and that I've used in my research.
I think the
Hmm.
question we should be asking, Chris, is, you could have chosen anything to write this paper on. Now, there must have been something that drew you to the UFO phenomenon itself.
That's
That's the
right.
more interesting question to me.
What was the appeal for
Yeah,
you?
well, for me, the appeal is that this story existed, right? And this happened in 1967. Books had been written, because Chris had done all of this pioneering work. There were documentaries that had been made about it, and it's a piece of Canadian cultural history. And so I was interested in this really from the perspective of this being a local legend, and that there was a museum, right? Because I do come at it from that heritage lens, that I'm interested in what museums do and how museums exhibit controversial topics and phenomena. And Shag Harbour really was a good case study for the kinds of things that I was interested in looking into. And that's really what brought me to the topic. I would say, like, I am certainly interested in the UFO phenomena. In future research, I hope to look at examples that we have here in Newfoundland. Um, but
There's some
really,
good
there
ones.
there
There's
sure
some great
are.
ones there. Yes.
There sure are. So, there's lots of work to be done, and I think that's another interesting point too. There's a lot
Mm.
of interesting work to be done in relationship with the UFO phenomena, regardless of what disciplinary perspective we happen to come at this from. Whether we do come at it from a scientific perspective, which I hope my colleagues in the hard sciences, awaken from what more than 50 years of not wanting to touch this topic, post Condon. And there was even, lots of hostility before Condon happened, of course. But, I do hope that there are, there's reappraisals of the phenomena that happen from those perspectives, but there's certainly lots of great work that's being done by my colleagues in the social sciences and humanities. And I hope that that work continues because there's a lot of interesting things for us to study and explore.
Science
This
is
was a
definitely
cult.
expanding for sure
Yeah,
right now. We're
yeah.
in a bit of a golden era for all of this. There's a lot of good work being done. Unfortunately, it's being used under the guise of a threat. But you know what? We need to get funding and interest into the field. And if you've got to use monikers like a threat to get there, then we need to get there because
Mm.
culturally and potentially scientifically, it's one of the most important questions we can ask, and the answers that it might provide, are just enormous. So, are you telling us, Noah, that you've never had any unusual experiences at all? Maybe you or a family member saw a UFO or something that drew you to this. Have you had any strange encounters with any of the plethora of unusual stuff that we hear about?
Yeah, I've had experiences myself when I was in high school. I'd say maybe I was about 16 or 17 years old. I remember it was late at night. I lived in a subdivision in Ontario, and it's probably what, maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. There was this bright light out from behind where our backyard was. And there was this ball of blue light. I would say no larger. It was about twice the size of a basketball, right, roughly. And all of a
Apparent size.
sudden, yeah.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, it just shot up into the sky. And there were three others that kind of came across the sky at the exact same time when this object moved up into the sky and it moved off with them. Sighting didn't last probably more than 10 seconds. But I've it was a fascinating experience. I can't say one way or the other what it was. I saw it, right?
Hmm. Well, something, when we talk about culture, when I first began work and I first started getting public attention about the Shag Harbour incident, one of the things I had thought of was that it was within the field kind of a cultural shock. Because when I'd go down to present in the US, when I first started getting invited to MUFON symposiums and, private presentations for people about my work on the incident, one of the things that kept coming up, I would start out and I would try to make them see what it was like in a little tiny fishing village on the coast of Nova Scotia. And how I would do that is I would say, it's the night of October the 4th, 1967. There is no Roswell. And they would go, whoa, wait, Chris, Roswell happened in 1947. And who knew that? When it slipped into the dustbin of history and came out of the headlines back then, it was forgotten and wasn't revived until the work of Stanton Friedman and the release of the book in 1979, The Roswell Incident, not by Friedman, though he did the research and was uncredited. The first book out about it would have been done by Charles Berlitz of, Bermuda Triangle fame, and William Moore. And before that, the field of UFOs actually never seriously considered that a crash scenario. Roswell came and went. And then again, it's problematic because in Roswell, as I like to say, where is the UFO? And I'm not talking about Hangar 18 or that kind of speculation, but when you really look at the facts of the case, the night of the incident there was a lightning storm and nobody saw or reported a UFO. In Shag Harbour, at least people saw a UFO, but didn't report one. Simply that it's very confusing. So I used to get this across to them. So the point being, Roswell was not an influence to the people's thinking in this village. It was unknown. At the time, the prevalent, the dominant idea within the field is these things are all weather craft, superior technology, they don't crash. So it was a bit of a shake up. It was a period of adjustment, and it kind of had been murky. And I would have to point this out. Nowadays, the Americans have certainly embraced it. I can remember wondering, are they going to be interested in the Canadian case? Because obviously, when you're down there, the U.S. audience seems less interested in European cases around, but they readily embrace this. And I think part of it was they felt the field needed this. It needed the certainty of this case. Roswell gets weighed down with questions of the validity of the MJ 12 documents, whereas our documents, as you know, whether they were from D&D HQ or, I always want to say National Archives, but Library and Archives Canada, St. Mary's University, the APRO report, very clearly, the pedigree is good. They exist, they come from known sources. There's no funny business there. So, it's been a period, so there was that kind of cultural shock. I can remember going down and, one of the first questions when I finished the first lecture, I think that was in Greensboro, North Carolina, at the end, there was a lot of applause. And I felt good about that because um, the speaker before me was Kevin Randall, and he got booed. I thought, man, tough crowd. I expected this to be a love-in, and I was a little nervous. And I thought, God, are they going to even care? Are they going to yawn about a Canadian story in a fishing village? And how the people reacted and couldn't accept what they were seeing. And that's a factor here. But it was well accepted. It's grown to what it was. But I can remember one of the first questions, and I realized I wasn't home anymore in Nova Scotia. Was I was waiting and look and then calm down, and I go, oh, the gentleman in back there that raised his hands, and the first thing he asked me is, "You seem to have been really an irritant in getting the background behind the government and police and that." He goes, "Have you ever been bothered by men in black?" And I thought, oh God, I'm not home anymore. Nobody at home ever asked me this. So I started saying no. I said the only resistance I met, I said there was once a guy from the Coast Guard in a cheap brown polyester suit and they all started to laugh because I guess that wasn't as scary as a man in black. You
Yeah,
know,
Man in Brown just doesn't have the same appeal.
Men in
You talk
brown,
about
not
you talk about
scary, not
pet
scary.
pedigree, Chris, is a great term to use here because we have Noah here, and I'd love to just like explore the tentacles of the octopus that we have in a guy like Noah and the reach that he's got in his studies. One of the big questions I had, I noticed on one of your profiles, is that you've done work in the Quaker community. My question to you is, and maybe you've talked to other colleagues as well, with a group like the Quakers, they're pretty private, they're not public, you don't hear a lot about what's going on inside there. Do they have you ever broached the subject of unusual activity within their own traditional communities, or heard from your peers if there's anyone else in those quiet communities that share the same experiences based on your experience? I mean, the experience is not limited to any one people, but I'm just curious in the cultural context and how they share or value the information if you're aware of it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Um, for I can only speak from the Quaker communities that because there's great diversity in the Quaker tradition, of course. In the communities that I've worked with are liberal Quaker communities, and there I think there's a great openness to these kinds of questions, to phenomena that we may not have firm explanations for. And that comes, I think, from the perspective that, the tradition is not theologically conservative, right? That, these are folks who are generally open to new interpretation of, of scripture and of their own religious tradition, right? Now, that differs significantly from some of the religious communities that are around the Shag Harbour area, right? That part of Nova Scotia is very Baptist, and there are some very conservative interpretations and traditions related to that particular Baptist faith that exists in the area of Shag Harbour. And one of the things I found fascinating during my research was that there's the community we would call Shag Harbour, right? People who live there, but there are communities within the community, right? And some of it is denominational, really. It depends on, which particular congregation you belong to. And, those folks are very closely tied to those congregations, and they're very close knit communities, right? And for some of those communities, the UFO topic is a no-go right off the get-go, right? They're not interested in talking about this. Whether or not something even happened the night of October 4th, 1967, is contested in some of these communities, right? I talked with a few, folks who just outright said nothing happened, right? Nothing happened that night. If anything did happen, it was some kind of misidentified, who knows what it was, but it wasn't a UFO. You know, really, there was nothing that happened. Now, I've also had other people tell me, that what happened may be demonic, right? And that was their interpretation, and that's how they thought and felt about this, right? So within those communities, right, there are varied interpretations, and different kinds of responses to the UFO phenomena generally. Um, and it's very, very interesting. I remember actually I was working. I was in the Shag Harbour UFO Museum, and I was giving tours. And I had a couple who came in. They were an older couple. They were retired, and the husband was super interested in the exhibits, right? He walked around, he wanted to talk about, he was interested in the story, he was interested in the government reports that we had on exhibit, he was really interested in some of the other materials that were there. He wanted to talk about, programs that he had watched on the Discovery and History Channel about UFOs, right? He was into the topic. His wife, on the other hand, completely different. I had a chance to have a conversation with her, and she identified her as being Pentecostal, and she basically said to me that I've heard these stories of folks being abducted by aliens, and based on my religious faith, nothing that my God created would do something like that to another human being. And
Yeah, it's an
basically, yeah,
yeah,
basically
that's
saying that this is a demonic phenomena.
yeah, and you do hear a lot of these different interpretations, like you said. One person that comes to mind is, a fellow like Jacques Vallée with his, his many works, but his great work Passport to Magonia sort of showcases the concept that he could be, an ontological neutralist, for lack of a better way of saying it, because he's looking at the phenomenon from what it presents itself to the world. Now, these interpretations globally give it all different lenses, which also has made it difficult in the past to sort of weed through it and create a cohesive picture. But a guy like that sort of thinks that perhaps a lot of these legends and things that we hear that are so they seemingly different on the outside, once you look in, could possibly be one and the same phenomenon, which stretch back, it seems, to the beginning of the ability to communicate, really.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I mean, I his point is well taken. I am perhaps, as a result of my own ontological neutrality, I'm hesitant to draw that conclusion. The reason being is that the traditions of seeing lights either in the sky or near the water that you are unable to explain, we have to understand them within the cultural context in which they are happening, right? And whether or not this is Irish and Scottish fairy lore, whether or not we're talking about ghost ships or other forms of supernatural lights that have occurred here in our own maritime Atlantic Canadian context, right? There's cultural specificity here, and I we can't lose sight of that, when we're really thinking through this. And what it means is there's a lot of research to be done, right? I think his work is a good starting point, but we have a lot of work to do, before we can really begin to draw those kind of overarching conclusions.
Yeah, it's hard to pull you out of character, isn't it? I love your I love your perspective. It's so scientific and you're right in there. I really appreciate your point of view and your contribution to science.
As far as the demonic thing goes, more than once I've been accused. I've had people stand and point at me and say, "You were doing the work of the devil."
Yeah.
And once it happened, it's funny when you mentioned Quakers. I had a bit of a hobby of, well, I'm kind of interested in architecture. And when you drive around Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, you can spot the Quaker houses, or what used to be Quakers, quite readily, because they tended to have very steeply pitched roofs and five sided dormers. There were certain features like that that were very, specific to the homes they would build. And some of these homes date from the late 1700s and the presence of Quaker whalers here that later pulled up stakes and went to Nantucket. And in one of these homes, there was a gentleman. I was just looking at it, admiring the house. He come out and he looked at me. He says, "I've seen you before." And I thought, geez, I wonder if he's Quaker, I mean, he didn't look like the guy on the oatmeal box or anything. He was dressed in common street dress, but I just thought, I don't know, there was something about the way he presented himself. And I said who I was, and he said, "You do the work of the devil." And I said, "Oh, well, I'm sorry you feel that way." I said, "But are you a Quaker, sir?" And he said, "No, I'm a Jehovah's Witness," and slammed the door. Well, I don't want to disrespect anybody's faith and this sort of thing, but I have a problem with closed minds for any reason, and I've kind of made it a hobby to open minds. And one of the things I've enjoyed in the field, my work is how I've been kind of accepted and skate between all the different genres, and haven't been attacked, and in fact have often been praised by known skeptics of the past and the present. I mean, a great example of someone who's no longer here, Phil Class, when he first heard me speak live down in the U.S., he approached me afterwards and complimented on what a great job I'd done. And coming from him, this was real praise. He said, "I remember that case, and something did happen there." And he said, "No, you did a fantastic job." He said, "And I will tell you this," he says, "I'll probably write something about it on my website. Don't let that bother you," he said. But he played it safe and never did. So, you know, there you go. Listen, I'm wondering now, I am. It's been insightful to me to hear you go on about Shag Harbour and that, and we could go on and on about it. And you're right. There is a local thing there. In fact, when I first went down, there was no Shag Harbour Incident Society. And the first people that kind of looked after things in the area was the Chapel Hill Historic Society. And I can remember whenever something was suggested, "I'll come down some Sunday. I have a free day there that I'm not working," or whatever. You say, "Oh, no, Sunday's no good." I can remember that used to come up. And, and that hasn't been the case with the current Incident Society. But I'd like to just touch on a few things because, before our time is up here in Newfoundland, because Newfoundland across Canada, it's pretty unique, some of the phenomena we see there. Have you ever looked? One of the things that always fascinated me, because there's potentially, from a ufological point of view, some kind of stra- distant or maybe at least strained connection with close encounters and the abduction phenomena, but there's that similarity of features in reports of an attack of the Hague. And you'll have to explain to our audience, because I'm sure most people, particularly beyond Newfoundland and certainly beyond Canada, what a Hague event or what the Hague is in terms
Yeah,
of.
great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, the old hag. It's a tradition, a supernatural belief tradition,
Mm.
where someone wakes up paralyzed, and there is a figure in the room with them, sometimes actually pushing right down on their chest, and they're paralyzed and they
Yes.
cannot move. And if you had that experience in Newfoundland, you would just say you were hagged, right? You had a hag experience, the night before, and
So it's a verb too, eh? A verb.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's that, and that it's been that way for for forever. There's been some really great work done on that. David Hufford was a folklorist who studied the old hag tradition in Newfoundland, and his work really was pioneering in the discipline of supernatural folklore. And he wrote some really fascinating pieces. His book, The Terror That Comes in the Night, explores the old hag phenomena.
Great
And then
title.
yeah, and then there were a number of articles that he also wrote based on his work, and it's fascinating in the context of the program. Just generally, the theme of forbidden science, because in some of his work, he really explores the skeptical extremely hostile reaction of many academics to supernatural topics. And, he even went so far as to actually explore skepticism itself as a belief system. And that work really was pioneering. And when I say that I approach my work from a perspective of ontological neutrality, it really is because of his work on the old hag. And that's
Mhm.
true, I think, for a lot of scholars within my discipline, that, we have come to understand that, whatever these phenomena are, and in some instances, we really don't know. And in Newfoundland, there are some really interesting examples of supernatural folklore that don't even really have names. They're just things that
Could you give an
happen.
example? Give us one
Sure.
example.
Sure, like there's the tradition here of, and again, they don't really have a name. Some people would call them fairy lights. I've heard other people just refer to them as lights. Sometimes they get referred to as ghost ships, though ghost ships, those experiences are tend to be a little bit more specific, and the actual, the whatever the object is that they encounter looks as if it's a ship in the fog. But there are many communities where people during the evening, there are these lights that appear over their harbor. And, there are stories of, fishermen getting in their boats, trying to go out to these lights to try to discover what exactly they are, but the light will move off, right? And it maintains a constant distance from, the fishermen trying to discover its identity. And then there are other cases where these lights just appear and disappear. They may appear and disappear into a fog.
Yeah.
And in some communities, I've heard people just refer to, well, yeah, that's the light, and that's what it's called,
Yeah.
right? There's no real explanation for what it is or why it's there, but it's just the light. And I know your work in Shag Harbour, you've encountered some of these stories too.
Yeah, it
Um,
is more of a UFO twist. What you've just described, the Nova Scotia equivalent, I suppose, would be the teaser sightings, in Mahone Bay. I've
mhm,
seen a burning ship in the distance and it just becomes a light and you can never reach it and it's lost in the fog. But since you say that I've encountered it, yeah, and I'll be real brief here because this is your show. But the example here and what makes it more of a UFO thing than just a tradition thing here is, when you're in Southwest Nova, that whole area, Clark's Harbor, Shag Harbor, Woods Harbor, whatever, Lunenburg, what you find down there is that I would encounter people that say, no, I don't know anything about UFOs, never seen them. All I know is mom and dad told me that when we see those little orange balls on the beach or the lights come up out of the water, don't go near them. And we tell our kids the same. I don't mess with it. It's just a
yeah,
fact of life. They live with it in their daily life,
yeah.
and the sightings abound down there of these things. Aha, the terror that comes in the night.
There you go. And that is fascinating. The old hag syndrome is fascinating, and it's super easy going into the UFO literature to see that stories of alien abductions are littered with these sort of accounts of
Mhm,
what at one
Mm,
point may have been called incubus or succubi or old hag for that
mm.
matter, where there's that sense of helplessness. They're awake but they can't move. They're paralyzed, and it's impossible not to make the connection that this could be in fact the exact same phenomenon, right? Like you as a cultural historian looking into all this stuff would be the first to sort of point that out. I think it's
In
fascinating that we have our own
Yeah,
history here.
yeah, Noah. In the Hague, in any of the Hague reported stories, like, is there ever a communication? I think that's the thing that's lacking, isn't it? That makes it different, say, with a modern malevolent close encounter or something. Like, is there ever any communication with the entity?
I honestly can't say. I'm not
Hmm.
an expert on the old hag tradition, and I have never worked with it any of that material extensively. What I would say is that there's also the tradition of fairy abduction too, and
Oh, yes.
there are a number of documented cases of that here in Newfoundland, or even people reporting being disoriented while in the woods. There are even cases of people encountering small beings that they describe as fairies, and that's a long-standing tradition. And in Passport to Magonia, it explores the connection between fairy lore
Mm,
and the UFO phenomena, and the connections are many. There's the tradition of the fairy abduction. There's the tradition of the blast, where someone, as a result of a fairy encounter, may end up with either like a sliver or something that is implanted in their body that then results in health complications. There are encounters of people going to the fairy world. Of fairy homes looking like domes on the earth, fairies appearing and disappearing in a fog. Some people even refer to those lights we were talking about as fairy lights, right? So there are these very interesting connections between fairy lore tradition and the UFO phenomenon. And, other folklorists have pointed this out. In fact, there's even folklorists who have pointed out the relationship between traditional folklore and the Men in Black phenomena as well, right? So, none of this, from that perspective, nothing that we're talking about here, whether it's UFOs, alien abduction, the Men in Black, none of this is unprecedented, right?
Yeah.
There are traditional examples.
And if there's one thing I've learned about the whole fairy phenomenon is do not drink the drink or eat the food that they offer you because you may
yes.
never
No.
come back. And there's
Never.
actually a UFO case based on that similar sort of situation where the guy was offered pancakes and he saved a couple and had them analyzed and said they tasted like cardboard, but he also had experience is with these otherworldly characters, right? So
Yeah.
there is definitely there's a cross of these cultural stories happening, definitely historically and worldwide. It's very, very interesting. And I actually came across a map of Nova Scotia one time that had like I want to say 6 to 9 supposed fairy mounds that were sort of in and around the whole province, and I found that fascinating too, and something I think that warrants further investigation. I think it's showcasing as well. I think that would be fascinating to learn more about.
The only place I've ever encountered a fairy story, and it was an amazing one in Nova Scotia, was in Eskazoni,
Hmm.
on Cape Breton, of course. When you were on the in the reservation territory there, and some of the elders, two women who I spoke with, told me stories of where when they were very young, they went out on picnics and they actually claimed that groups of fairies came out and attacked the picnic trying to get their stuff and they had to physically fight them off. And it was just fascinating to hear this and to see all these years later the emotional reaction when they would tell these stories and how insistent they were that it was exactly as illustrated. And all I could do was sit there and listen and just it it was fascinating. These people live with this, and in modern times it was integral to how they see the world in a place they live, that's so special and separate from most of our modern Canadian culture. I just love those moments.
Yeah, it's like the Hopkinsville Goblin story too, right? Where they're attacking these people in this cabin, and there's an altercation taking place between these things. And let's just say it was 300 years ago. It would could have been interpreted as goblins or fairies or whatever they called it, goblins, because that's all they had reference for back then. But now we interpret that as a potential, alien attack. But I mean, what story is right? That's what makes it so interesting. It's like a good Bob Dylan song, it can mean anything to anyone depending on when or where or who's listening to it.
All along the watchtower.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, that's a great one. Okay,
Fascinating
so
stuff.
Newfoundland. Okay, there's the hag. There's some of the unusual things which I would class as a teaser light. But in terms of modern type UFO stories, back in the 70s, the 80s, and of course since there, Newfoundland has some great cases. I don't know how where you are, Noah, or why there would be a reason, but maybe so. Have you ever had looked into at all, say things like the Breen sighting, from the Cessna that he was flying from? Where was it? He was headed to Gander from Deer Lake, I believe. Yeah. Have you ever a case like? Well, another one would be Clarenville,
Mm.
and of
Oh,
course that. Go ahead. Yeah.
well, I was just going to say, like, I don't, again, my research has been focused in Shag Harbour, so I haven't really done any work on, those specific cases as they've happened in here in
Mm,
Newfoundland. And like the interesting thing is, right, there's been a folklore department at Memorial since the 1970s, right? And when I was preparing to do my work in Shag Harbour, one of the first things I did was look for Newfoundland examples. What
mm-hmm,
did we have in the Folklore and Language Archive at Memorial, which is the largest collection of folklore related material in Canada? And there's virtually nothing on UFOs in our
mm-hmm.
holdings other than, those kind of tradition, those encounters of seeing a light in the harbor and not knowing what it was. That was it. That's really all that came up in there. So, the thing is, there are these interesting sightings, like the one that happened in Clarenville that, very recently was commemorated by the Canadian Mint, right, with a
The third,
coin.
the third coin.
Yeah.
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 And I think that was like Shag Harbor was the second, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And like the thing is that's so interesting about this is that, you know, despite the fact we have a department devoted to the study of folklore and that folklore traditions in our province generally are very very well documented, um, these cases are not particularly well studied or well documented. And I don't know what the explanation for that is. The I guess the focus has always been on things that appear to be traditional, right, that appear to be
Mm-hmm,
older. And because UFOs kind of have this taint of modernity, right, as
mm-hmm.
far as some scholars might be, may feel that they are, there has they've been neglected, which is unfortunate. And I think there's potential here for really valuable work to be
It
done.
sounds like a
Yeah.
job opportunity, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Noah, you were wise to go to Shag Harbor because at least like you say, your summers there were spent getting this stuff. I've been in there. Remember, Justin, when we were there and heard the portal story that day at the 50th anniversary when we stepped out to get some air? And you're right, the museum serves that function and it serves it well. And wow. There's just no end. I've often called Shag Harbor the gift that keeps on giving, and I guess it's given to you beyond our shores. Well, there's a signal. I hear our fabulous, moody music here that'll take us out. I want to thank you for coming on and doing with us today this show, on Forbidden Science. Someday I'm going to answer who's forbidding this, but, and this I'm not a scientist. I'm not even an academic, but I've enjoyed their help so much in the case and on other things. And perhaps when we have more time and a slot, we'll have you back to talk some other things because I'm just never run out of questions. Again, thank you so much. And thank you, Justin, for filling in as a co host here with provocative questions. Still can't believe I had to give you a poke to get you started. That's Justin Brown. I
You don't
haven't
want to get
seen
me
till
started
today.
sometime.
No.
You know what, Noah?
Anyway,
It's really, really great to have talked to you too, because I've known you in the past, and I had no idea that you had this rich past involving folklore of not only
yeah.
Newfoundland but the maritime provinces. So, thank you for your contribution to history.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. No, it has all the way around.
Thanks, Chris.
Anytime. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Music's going to take us out, I think.